Yeah, hello everybody to our course Macroeconomics. The reason why I'm late is just this one here, that yesterday we had the handover of the annual report of the Council of Economic Advisors in Germany in Berlin. Very turbulent times because, well, the government crashed, and maybe you clicked into the press conference. I think I sent you the link that also this committee is right now, yeah, uh, also let's say they do not have a common opinion. They are very diverse in their looking at the economy, and yeah, it will be therefore also quite interesting how this gremium, this committee develops in the future. Nonetheless, to have a look into this annual report is of course a good choice because it is an overall description of the state of the economy today in Germany, and there you find also all the parameters we have discussed, and of course in much more detail than I have done it. And also what I want to mention is that it is, yeah, I can say something like a tradition here, that every year I ask somebody of the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors to present the annual report, and this will be then on Tuesday 26. This is in 12 days, and Christopher Zuber, he is especially the guy looking, especially you see it here, at the productivity. So what we have talked about potential output, medium long-term growth, and so on. And he will then present the annual report at our university. Yeah, and then I took the night train back, and the train crashed twice at 3 and 4 o'clock, and therefore I was late today. So sorry for this, but then we can start with our lecture. Well, we were at the point of monetary policy, especially of the European Central Bank, with the central aim of 2% inflation rate in the medium term. And then we discussed different instruments the central bank is using, and yeah, the main one is the main refinancing operations, and this is giving out central bank money to the private banks, and they hand it out with the so-called key interest rate. And you hear this term, and then we talked also about how this interest rate is feeding through the economy, and especially this is a short-term interest rate, and there is of course not only one interest rate in the economy, but we have different interest rates dependent on the maturity of our bonds, and that this curve we call the yield curve, and there we stopped last in the last lecture, that this yield curve is very interesting because we can use this yield curve so to speak, as an economic indicator and especially as an crisis indicator, because from this market expectation theory we can derive a very nice dependence of, and this is this part here, the interest rates which we have today, long-term 4% and 2% short-term, and the short-term expected interest rates. And from this dependence, we see it depends if this that these short-term expected interest rates are lower than the actual short-term interest rates if this bracket is negative, and it is higher if this bracket, as it is in our example, if it is positive. So short-term interest rate today is 2%, and from this equation with 4 and 2, we obtain that short-term expected interest rates would be 6%, so higher than the actual short-term interest rate. And in the other way around, if we would interchange, if the situation would be that the short-term interest rate would be 4 and the long-term would be 2, then of course we would have here 2 plus, brackets open, 2 minus 4, this is negative, minus 2, so 2 minus 2 would be then that the market is expecting 0% for the short-term expected interest rate. And especially in such a case, when the market is expecting a decrease of short-term interest rate in the future, then we can ask ourselves, when does this happen? What kind of situation do we have? Well, we have talked about this, that the central bank is steering or tries to steer the short-term interest rates. So in such a case, expecting falling short-term interest rates means also that we expect or that we are in a situation where the central bank is starting to lower the interest rates. And when does the central bank is doing this? Well, it is doing this when the economy is in a downturn or in a crisis, because then credits will become cheaper and I can hope that I push the economy via this decrease of short-term interest rates. And therefore, we can then overall derive that if short-term interest rates would be lower than long-term interest rates, that then there is a crisis at the horizon. Well, and then we can look in the historical data, and actually we find that before every deep crisis in history, we have found the situation that short-term interest rates were larger than long-term interest rates. And this also I put down here. The dependence of short-term expected interest rates equals long-term interest rates plus the difference between long-term and short-term rates. Okay, and such a situation, as I mentioned it, if short-term interest rates are larger than long-term interest rates, this we call an inverse yield curve, because this situation, if long-term interest rates would be larger than short-term interest rates, so I1, I2, let's say 1 year 2 years. This we call a normal yield curve. And why do we say that this is the standard, this is the normal case? This is due to another explanation that short-term and long-term interest rates fall apart, and this is the so-called liquidity premium theory. And within the liquidity premium theory, we abandon from our assumption in the market expectation theory that the investors, the economic agents, are risk neutral. Now we assume that investors are in general risk averse. Well, and this is actually just an empirical fact that in general or on average, we find that people, we, the investors in general, are risk averse. So this is also not a law or something like this. This is just an empirical fact that if we go down, if we go downtown and if we ask 10,000 people, that then on average we would get the answer that we are risk averse. So, and what does this mean? This means that if I'm giving away my money as a creditor, then I want a premium for the case when if I give away my money a very long time. And because why? I charge the debtor a higher interest rate for a longer credit compared to a shorter credit is that we make the example. Let's say I give a credit for 1 year compared to a credit of 5 years. Then within these 5 years, there could something happen to my debtor, that he becomes unemployed, for example, and that therefore I have a higher probability that I don't get my money back. And the second point is, well, today, let's say I say on my banking account I have 10,000 euros and I don't need it today. So I can give this away as a credit to my neighbor, for example. But then, of course, in the future, if the maturity is 5 years, within 2 or 3 years, my plans can also change. That, for example, my car is driving very well today, and I assume that my car is also driving the next 5 years. But then I have an accident in 3 years, and then I think, well, I need a new car, but then I don't have my 10,000 euros. And for this, that I'm not liquid anymore, if I give my money a long time away with a credit, this we call then the liquidity premium theory, that I take a premium for giving away my money a long time. And this behavior, which we also find in general in the market, is then the reason that in most cases we see that long-term interest rates are larger than short-term interest rates, and therefore we call this a normal yield curve. And then we have a third explanation that interest rates for different maturities are falling apart. And this is the so-called market segmentation theory. Oh, this is in German, sorry. Did I have just to translate? Well, let's use just artificial intelligence. And risk arises for an investor if the investment horizon does not coincide with the term of the security. Yeah, very good. Better than myself. This market segmentation theory, there we think that the market for bonds is splitting. Because let's say you are an investor and you have an investment horizon of, let's say, 7 years. But if you go to the market, you find only bonds with an interest rate you are looking for with a maturity of, let's say, 10 years. Well, then you have a risk when you are buying this 10-year bonds with an investment horizon of 7 years, because you cannot hold the bond until the end, until the 10 years. You are selling the bond after 7 years. But in 7 years, you don't know what is the price of the bond, because you don't hold it until the end. Then you get out your 100 which you have invested plus the coupon payments. But in 7 years, maybe it's 101 or maybe it's only 95. And therefore, you have a price risk. In the other case, let's again say investment horizon 7 years, and the bonds you are finding have only a maturity of 5 years. Well, then you have an income risk. Why do you have an income risk? Well, you are buying these 5-year bonds. Then you get your money back after 5 years plus 5-year coupon payment. And then you are reinvesting your money in a new bond until the full 7 years. But then you don't know what you are earning overall. Because for the left 2 years, where you haven't found a bond today, you don't know what you get in the future. And therefore you have an income risk. And for this, we assume then that, so to speak, the market is splitting in different segments, let's say in short-term bonds, medium-term bonds, and long-term bonds. So, for example, in 3 different segments of short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And for all this, for the short-term, for the medium-term, with same interest rate let's say I1, I2, I3, but all these are different. Well, to sum this up, as I mentioned, this expectation theory, we find that before every deep crisis in history, we have this inversion, which could be explained by the expectation theory. So we find this theory really established in practical situations. Also, mainly we see this normal yield curve. So also we can say that we find in practice this liquidity premium theory to be valid, but the segmentation theory is hard to find in practical situations. So there it is an explanation, but we cannot really verify it in practice. So this can hardly be verified in practice, while we find that the two other theories are more or less valid in practice. Okay, and here I show you some yield curves in history and more or less the actual history which we have right now. And what I have already told you is here in this part, in the actual situation, we have this inversion. So this is really a clear signal that something is wrong in Germany, in our economy. Today's inversion of the yield curve. Well, and then we have here the in November 2000, and there you see a quite flat, normal but flat yield curve. And the two others, when you look at 15th of September 2008, here you have the inversion. And why do I have chosen this date? You have an idea? Yep. Yes, it is the year of the financial crisis, and it is a very special day. Which event, at which event more or less crystallized the financial crisis? In the internet, does anybody know it? So on 16th of September 2008, Lehman Brothers crashed. And Lehman Brothers is the fifth or was the fifth, sixth largest bank in the world. And well, just in this time, I was in the staff of the Council of Economic Advisors, and over summertime 2008, we have started to count the defaults within the portfolios, but within the balance sheet of the banks. That that we really saw, well, there is a problem in the banking sector. And in parallel, the oil price in summer 2008 really went up to its highest point at 150 US dollars per barrel. So inflation really went up. So then there was in summer 2008 the discussion, well, inflation is more or less exploding, and high inflation rates are in general a signal that you have a very high demand. Demand shift curve is shifting outward. So therefore it was the interpretation, well, there is some problem in the US housing market. Yeah, yes, we see also a problem in the financial sector, in the banking sector, but this has no impact on the real economy. And then when this, one of the largest banks in the world, crashed, so in the end, an investment at Lehman Brothers, you got back from $1.08. So almost a loss of 100%. So this then initiated the start of the deep crisis, and in directly 2 weeks later, all large central banks in the world simultaneously cut their interest rates. And this was then, so to speak, the starting point of going down to zero key interest rates in the world. And well, if you would have had a look at the yield curve a day before, and of course, if you go then in the end of August, you also see that it is already an inverse yield curve. So the market has given the clear signal, well, there will be happen something. There is something wrong. We expect that in the near time, central banks will cut their interest rates. And this they are doing if we have a downturn in the real economy. Well, and then, of course, we had this really deep crisis with an shrinking economy of Germany of 5% in 2009. Well, and then I also brought you the yield curve of 6th of March 2020. And here, not very much, but we see a light inversion oops. And if we take the liquidity premium theory and the expectation theory together, then we can also argue that a little part of the higher long-term interest rates is just due to the liquidity premium. And so we could say that our equation, which we derived for the expectation theory, short-term expected interest rates, is long-term interest rate, I2, but then we can say that within these I2 we find also a liquidity premium. And this we can take out, and then we can say, well, if long-term interest rates are maybe 3%, then we maybe can say that 0.5% of these 3% are just due to the liquidity premium theory. So when we want to argue with the expectation theory, then the relevant long-term interest rate would be then I2 plus some liquidity premium. I2 plus LP minus I1. And from this, we can argue that also a flat yield curve can be interpreted as an inversion. So in this very light inversion here, maybe we can say it is a bit deeper because within these longer term interest rate here, maybe 3 years, is also a liquidity premium of 0.5 percentage points. So we can then also say here we see also the inversion, 6th of March 2020. Because why I chose this date? Yep. Yes. So Corona starts in Europe. And maybe you remember in January, in February, we still smiled about what happened in Asia. We smiled about the tourists on the ships sitting there in quarantine, already wearing their masks. And I also remember I was here in the lecture hall, and I think we had then the shutdown at 18th of March or something like that, the first one. So I had 3 weeks of lecture in summer term 2020. And I did a nice calculation because there the absolute number in the beginning of March of corona patients in Germany was roughly 100. And then I did with the students together also a growth process. Maybe you know this, when you take a flower at a sea, which is doubling every day. How long does it take that the sea is packed with flowers? And here I took the infection rate beginning at February until March, coming to a number of 100 patients in Germany. And if this goes on, how long does it take that everybody is infected? And roughly the estimation was in October. And yeah, well, so we more or less still smiled in this time. Well, there is something, but nothing happens in Europe. But what you see here in the market that you already have here an inversion of the yield curve. So the market has already the signal there is something. There will something happen. Well, and then what happens? We all know this. Okay, so that much for the yield curve, and I also recommend, where do I have it here? It is on German, but maybe you understand this. Where is it? Yield curve here. I made also a video for the yield curve, and if you are interested in the pandemics, here I also did 2 videos to the pandemics. Here I forecasted a little bit what happens. This was at Easter, so in April 2020. Okay, so please in the future have a look on this yield curve. Well, for really direct forecast, of course, it is hard, but qualitatively, you really can say if you see the inversion, be careful in the future. Okay, and then a short overview. Now we are after Lehman Brothers. What happened? We had here the so-called classical monetary policy instruments, and then we really start to invent many other instruments. And this at the Council of Economic Advisors in this time was also my task to count everything, every new idea of the central bank. And this, was really a very intense time, because if we go through it this year, dropping interest rates very fast to 0%, and then we had a period of almost 10 years with 0% interest rates. Well, if I would have went to my PhD advisor in 2002, because I did my PhD in monetary policy, and would have presented him the idea, well, let me analyze a situation of 10-year zero key interest rate. What does this mean for an economy? Then he would have had smiled and say, well, it's an interesting idea, but it is not relevant. 10 years later, we were in this situation. Well, what happened also? So we really dropped interest rates, and then I told you, by law, the private banks need central bank money, and in order to obtain this central bank money, before the financial crisis, there was an auction every week. So the central bank, they calculated more or less, well, we will give out, let's say, 60 billion euros for this month. And then the private banks had to apply. Well, I want 2 billion and I'm bidding 2% interest rate. Another one, 2.5 billion, 2.2% interest rate. And then the central bank went through all this bidding, added every bid up until their 60 billion euros, which they wanted to hand out. And then it could be the case that a private bank, which has bid a too low interest rate, didn't get the central bank money. So they then had to go to their neighbor private bank to ask for this money. But in the financial crisis, especially with the crash of Lehman, this was a very unsecure situation in the financial markets. And therefore, the central bank changed this auction procedure to a so-called fixed rate tender with full allotment. And this more or less means that a central bank gets now as much money as they want for the key interest rate, though there is no auction anymore. And also, if they want to have a credit, they have also to give to the central bank some securities. And these securities, this had have to have a special rating, AAA, AA or something like this, until the financial crisis. But then within the financial crisis, the private bank, they had not anymore as much AAA, AA securities, and therefore the central bank downgraded the rating requirements. And all this double B, single B is still in the balance sheet of our central banks. This is still a high risk which we have there. Also, the main refinancing operation lasts only 1 week in this very turbulent times. This was also too short. Therefore, was the introduction of longer term operations that the private banks got the money not only for 1 week, but for 1 month, 3 months, until 1 year, and even until 3 years. Of course, the anchor currency in the world is US dollar, and therefore was a direct format between the ECB and the Fed that also European banks could directly get US dollar. And I mentioned it in 2011, 2012. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, especially the financial market in Italy had also a very, very high risk. And therefore, the European Central Bank gave out 3 years tenders of 500 billion euros. And compare this with GDP of Germany. GDP of Germany is 4 trillion. So this is 20% of GDP of Germany. So a really, really high number. And this was especially for the Italian and Spanish banking sector. Then also, and discussing the money market multiplier, of course, dropping the minimum reserve requirement from 2 to 1% means increasing the money market multiplier from 50 to 100. You remember, money market multiplier is 1 over the reserve rate. So if it's 2%, 1 over 2% is 50, and 1 over 1% is 100. So increase from 50 to 100. And then also, due to the Italian situation, we have this what we call a Draghi put. Have you already talked about financial derivatives, put options, call options, and something like this? So a put option in financial markets is just the right. You are buying the right today to sell a security tomorrow for a fixed price. And what Mario Draghi, president of the ECB announced at a conference in London in summer 2012. After that, there was just a press conference, and then one journalist asked, here in the Italian financial market, there is some there's something happen. What will the ECB are doing? And then Mario Draghi made this statement, and here you can see also the video with the link. This is very famous. He said a quotation: "Within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro." So to help the Italian economy. And believe me, it will be enough. So what is this? This is a promise. If government bonds of Italy going up and up and up, and this was the situation, we had this in general very, very low interest rates in Europe. So in Germany, 1% or something like this. And compared to this, we had interest rates of the government bonds of Italy of 5–10%. So a very high risk for the government in Italy, because if they have to pay a very high interest, then they have a problem with the public to finance the public expenditure, because they have they have to pay this high amount of interest. So this was more or less a promise for the market. Well, if you are still betting that Italy is crashing, then we will go into the private market and we will start to buy Italian government bonds in order to bring the Italian interest rates down. Well, and after this statement, after this speech, what happened? Without buying Italian government bonds, the interest rates of Italian government bonds went down. And because why? Well, if I'm still betting that they are increasing and believing the announcement of the European Central Bank, then I would lose money. So the market then more or less believed that in case the ECB would start to buy specifically Italian government bonds. So only the announcement had the reaction that in the financial market, the Italian interest rates came down. Well, but I think we have to admit this could function one time, maybe two times, but not always. Well, but nonetheless, in general, we had then the start of the so-called euro crisis. And not in this specific amount, but in general, the European Central Bank started to buy government bonds. And then in 2015, they really started to continuously buy government bonds, and so to speak, every month roughly an amount, and this changed over the years between 20 and 80 billion. So they started with 60 billion euros per month buying in general government bonds of the Eurozone. Well, and then we wanted to stop this in the end of 2019. And unfortunately, what happened in the beginning of 2020, this was the pandemic. And within the pandemic, we even started an additional program to stabilize financial markets. And now here you see this very large number of 1.7 trillion euros. Well, and then we are going further in history. The pandemic ended, and what then happened? Prices started to increase, and since July 2022, we had this increase of interest rates, and since 6 months, interest rates started to decrease again. So to speak, very interesting last 15 years in the financial markets and in monetary policy. So, and what we also see, what is not only interesting, but what one has to know is, we talked very much about the key interest rate, the interest rate of the main refinancing operations, that this is the steering interest rate for the short-term market interest rates. But what we see here is the red line in Ionia ESTR. This is the interbank short-term interest rate. So this is the interest rate which the ECB wants to steer. And what we see is, in the diagram, the black line is the key interest rate of the ECB. And what we see until financial crisis, we don't see the black line. Because why? Well, the ECB made a quite good job. The red line is just fluctuating around the key interest rate. And what then happened is that since then we see the black line. And what we see now is that the short-term red line market interest rate is now fluctuating around the interest rate of the deposit facility, the blue line. So since the financial crisis, the short-term market interest rate is following the interest rate of the deposit facility. And well, what is the reason? The reason is more or less that, where do we have it? Here was this decision in the beginning of the financial crisis that there is no auction anymore. And because of this, we more or less, or the markets now are oriented not at the interest rate of the refinancing, main refinancing operations, but on the deposit facility. Because why? The deposit facility is something like an insurance in our system. I can always put my money in case for the interest rate of the deposit facility to the central bank. And because I'm getting as much central bank money as I want, because of this, I'm now orienting at this endurance, so to speak, interest rate. So the reason is that there is no auction for central bank money anymore. Yeah, and in order to come to an end, let's see also at some other measures. This is the overall sum of the financial market interventions of the ECB. So all this buying government bonds, these PSPP, this is the pandemic purchase program, and the other ones are the programs in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And what you see here is that all this is roughly 3 trillion euro. So the ECB is buying private securities, especially government bonds, for 3 trillion euros. And what can we say to this, what we now find in the balance sheet of the central bank? Well, the ECB is the institution which can, so to speak, fiat money, invent money. They can print money. And what are they doing with this money? They are buying the bonds of the government in the European Monetary Union. And what did we have? We have roughly this, we estimated GDP of the EMU was roughly 15 trillion euros. So the ECB, therefore, holds roughly 3 over 15 is 20% of the public debt of the EMU. Well, the ECB is an institution of the European Monetary Union. So to speak, we are holding our own debt. In quotation marks, we are holding our own debt. And this I call, maybe you know this fairy tale, Baron von Münchhausen. Well, there is a fairy tale that he fell in a swamp, and how did he came out of the swamp? He took his own hand, took himself at his hair. I don't have any hair anymore. I can do it, but he has had long hair, and he took himself out of the swamp, pushing himself at his own hand. And therefore, I say this is some kind of Münchhausen financing, because we give to ourselves the credit. We give to ourselves a credit. And this, of course, is still a risk if you see here that it is 20% of GDP of the European Monetary Union. Well, it comes down But when we are now really not only in Germany but in Europe, see also the risk of the new president of the United States increasing the tolls, and that this would not mean that this amount really will drop in the near future. And therefore, I think that this is still a very high risk which we have in the balance sheet of the European Central Bank. Well, and here we see the overall balance sheet, and there we discussed that the balance sheet is more or less something like the monetary base within our economy. And here you see we come roughly before the financial crisis with a balance sheet of 1 trillion or 2 trillion, and here at the highest point in the corona crisis we have a 4, 5, 6 times higher balance sheet compared to the situation before the crisis. So this is a large increase of money. Well, and since we had this large increase of money, then again you can take quantity theory of money, that this will have the effect of inflation. Well, and therefore, also when the inflation started to increase in summer 2021, and this was half a year before the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine. There, the ECB really said, well, this is something that the people coming from Corona now restarted a little bit to consume, and therefore we have this, so to speak, little increase of prices. Well, my interpretation in this time was really that this risk from quantity theory of money and this large increase of the monetary base, that there we had really the power to just push inflation, and that we in summer 2021, when more or less Corona ended, that there we really had this effect from the quantity theory of money, that we have not only a short increase of prices, but a longer increase of prices. And then additionally, we had the horrible invasion in the Ukraine. Yeah, and then I want to show you the last picture, and this is maybe my favorite one. These are the interest rates of 10-year maturity government bonds in Europe. And if you are talking about what is the interest rate level within a country, then you mean mainly the interest rate of government, 10-year government bond. So this represents the interest rate level of a country. So if you somewhere have to do a market analysis of a country, then it would be looking at inflation, looking at economic growth, looking at unemployment, and also just have a look at the development of the 10-year government bond. This is also one of the key macroeconomic parameters of a country. Well, what we see here is that coming from the 1990s, the interest rates of the European countries fell apart. Very different interest rates in Europe. Well, and what happened then? This difference shrinks during time until roughly 1999. And then we had, until the financial crisis, from roughly 1999 until the financial crisis, EMU, European Monetary Union countries, had more or less the same interest rate. Well, and now I ask you, what did this meant in these times? What started in 1999? This hopefully you have learned in school when you discussed politics or something like this. Yeah. This was a little bit later than in 2000, 2001. There was also a crisis, but for Europe especially, 1999. What started? Well, this was the introduction of the euro. Yes, launch of euro. Well, and starting the euro, we had this Maastricht Treaty, and within this Maastricht Treaty, we had the so-called debt clause that the EMU member countries are not allowed to help each other when there is a problem of the financing the public expenditure. So every EMU country should look at their own debt. This was introducing the euro. We had the so-called no bailout clause. So by law, it was forbidden to take the debt of another country. But what we see is that every country in the EMU had the same interest rate of government bonds. But what is the interest rate of a government bond? The interest rate of a government bond is just the signal or the price. How risky is my investment in this country? If I think that an investment in Portugal is more riskful than an investment in German government bonds, then I would charge the Portuguese government a higher interest rate. So having these same interest rates, since the introduction of the euro, what does it mean? Market valued every member of the EMU with the same risk, same interest rates. Well, during this time, was there the situation that all countries had the same risk? So all countries had more or less the same economic performance? Of course not. They differed in the development. But still we have the same interest rate. So what does this then means? If their market is valuing it as the same risk, although there are different risks, well, this just then meant that the market didn't believe the no bailout clause. They just said, well, if there is a default of Portugal, then Germany and France will step by and help them, although it is forbidden. So market didn't believe the no bailout clause. Well, so it is more or less, again, a bet within the financial markets. Here the financial markets, the investors are right that this was written down in the Maastricht Treaty, and they just said, well, it is paper. But I don't believe you. That in case this law will not hold. Well, and what then happened? Financial crisis, especially the default of Greece, the very large problems in Southern Europe and also in Ireland. And what did we do? We stepped by and helped all the other countries. And then in the financial crisis, we helped each other. So this no belief in the no bailout clause, market expectations were right. So, and there you see really how powerful are financial markets. And yeah, because of this little history I could tell you, is this my more or less favorite diagram. Here we more or less can take all what we have learned right now about economic performance, interest rates, and monetary policy, and so on, and expectations, especially expectations, are very, very important in interpreting economic data, and that, yeah, you should be really careful when you think that you can bet against the financial markets. Okay, then that's all for this, and then now we are more or less at the end of the, so to speak, first part of the lecture, of the general description, what kind of parameters do we have, and the general functionality in our economy. And next week, then we start with the theory, and we start then with the Keynesian economics and walking through, and then we end with the neoclassical view. Okay, thank you very much, and hopefully then at 8:15. See you on Tuesday.